Sergeant Mia Kessler stood at the edge of the dusty airstrip, her boots sunk half an inch into the soft sand as the sun poured molten gold across the desert sky, her eyes squinting not from the light, but from the weight of everything she had carried. Through this deployment, through 12 months of heat, tension, fear, and death, she was down to the last few hours, her discharge papers signed her bag, packed her mind half detached from this place, already drifting toward a small town in Vermont, where the trees were beginning to turn orange, where her mother waited with cinnamon rolls and the quilt she had promised to finish for the return of her daughter from the war that never ended. Her squad had rotated out in batches, some broken, some dead, some simply gone, and she was one of the last. Not because she wanted to be, but because her paperwork was delayed due to a lost medevac report that still listed her as injured. Even though the shrapnel had only grazed her shoulder, she had walked. It off, then kept walking, kept pushing. Because the war did not care if you bled, it only cared that you kept breathing and shooting and following orders, which she had done without question, until the night in Al Raqqa when everything went off script, and no one ever talked about it again. She sat on a rusted metal bench outside the command tent, twirling her dog tags like prayer beads, her fingers moving on instinct, while her mind wandered across the upcoming flight itinerary. First, a short hop. To the green zone, then a 3-day layover in Germany, then home. It felt surreal, like she had imagined the entire war, like she would wake up any second back in basic, with her bunkmate yelling about drills and breakfast and officers. But no. This was real. The weight on her back was real. The dull throb behind her left eye was real, and so was the voice that suddenly hissed across the radio waves and froze her blood. The voice said her name, not a call sign, not a code, but her actual name. Mia, spoken slowly, like someone tasting it. After years of silence, her body snapped straight. She turned to the radio tent, where 2 comms officers were staring at each other, pale as bone. One of them grabbed the mic and shouted for identification. The other began running a trace, but the voice continued undeterred. It was low male and deliberate, with the calm of someone who had no need to rush and no fear of being stopped. "Mia, I see you," the voice said again, and for a moment she thought she might vomit. Because no one outside the base should have access to their channel. No one should know she was here. No one should know her name, not unless they were inside or unless they were watching from a distance with the kind of precision that meant premeditation and planning. The commanding officer stormed in barking questions as the techs struggled to trace the signal, which seemed to be bouncing between multiple sources like it was made to confuse them. And maybe this was the point all along. Not an attack, but a message. A psychological strike designed for one person and one person only. She stepped back away from the radio tent, her fingers twitching toward the sidearm she still wore, despite protocol, her breath shortening. As memories she had buried began to surge forward, memories of the night mission, the smoke, the flashbang, the intel gone wrong, and the house that exploded in a fireball of twisted metal and flame, but not before she saw the face of the man inside. The man holding a boy hostage, the man who stared at her without blinking as she pulled the trigger. There had been no confirmation, no body found, only scorched ground and debris, and after that the mission was scrubbed, the report sealed, and her team warned never to speak of it again. She had obeyed. She had locked it all away, but now the voice was back and it remembered everything. The radio crackled again, this time playing back coordinates, a set of numbers she knew without needing to check, because she had memorized them during the mission briefing. 8 months ago, they belonged to the village that no longer existed, the village they had erased under orders from someone whose name she never learned, but who wielded more authority than the entire chain of command combined. The voice kept repeating the coordinates, then paused and said 2 words that turned her spine to ice. Not yet. It was not a threat, not a warning. It was a promise, and Mia knew it was personal. Someone had survived. Someone had watched and waited, and now they had chosen to speak, not to the military, not to intelligence, not to the government, but to her. She backed into the shadows of the barracks unnoticed by the others who were too busy scrambling for satellite. Recon and signal jammers, her mind spinning. Not with fear, but with the raw need to understand who this was. And why now? Why today when she was supposed to leave, when she had finally convinced herself that her war was over? She opened her sat phone and scrolled past every contact until she reached one labeled Ghost, an encrypted line she had not used since the day after the village mission when she reported anomalies to a Black Ops handler who never spoke and only listened. She hit connect and waited, each second stretching longer than the last, until finally a digital tone answered, followed by silence. "He's back," she said, and the line went dead. She stared at the screen, then at the horizon where the wind had begun to shift, sending spirals of sand dancing across the dunes like ghosts risen from the deep, and suddenly she knew this was no longer about deployment. This was about unfinished business, about mistakes buried too shallow, and ghosts who did not forgive. She heard movement. Behind her, soft, deliberate, not military footsteps, and when she turned, no one was there. Only her shadow stretching long across the cracked ground as the sun dipped lower and the air grew colder with a promise of nightfall and whatever waited inside. She walked back toward the command tent but paused just before the entrance, catching something out of the corner of her eye, a shimmer on the ridge just beyond the wire fence, a glint like glass or a scope, and in that instant, her instinct screamed. At her, to run, to hide, to fight, but her legs would not move as the radio crackled once more and the voice whispered 3 new words: "You left me." The command tent turned into chaos. Within seconds, radios, chirping voices layered over voices, the base. Alarm still silent, because there had been no gunfire, no breach, no visible enemy, only a voice that knew her name and knew exactly what to say to paralyze her in front of everyone, like she had suddenly become a ghost in her own skin. The air felt thinner, the heat sharper, and her breath would not come in full, as if something had wrapped around her throat and refused to let go. Mia stayed outside watching the ridges where the light faded faster than it should have, the sun bleeding into the jagged skyline like a warning she could not interpret. She saw nothing, no movement, no glint this time, and yet the sensation remained crawling across her back like unseen fingers tracking her steps, remembering each scar she had earned and every life she had taken. Inside, the tent officers argued over next steps, debating electronic warfare and radio triangulation, while one young private stood frozen with his headset still on, still listening to the silence as if expecting the voice to return at any second. And it did not disappoint. The signal cut through with perfect clarity and spoke her name again, softer now, like it was standing right behind her, whispering, "Mia, you remember me?" She turned and no one was there. Just the hot wind and the shadows of a base built to withstand bombs, but not ghosts. Her heart slammed against her ribs, not from fear, but from recognition, because there was something in that voice, something familiar, a cadence, a pause between syllables that triggered, a memory buried beneath layers of denial, a memory soaked in blood and flame and screaming. The commander ordered her into the fortified comms bunker for protection, but protection from what they still did not understand what they were up against. They thought this was interference or cyber warfare or maybe an enemy sniper testing their defenses. But Mia knew this was not about them. This was about her. This was someone who had waited and watched and learned her patterns, her habits, her flaws, and now was reaching out not to kill but to torment her first. She complied anyway, walking through the halls of the base with eyes scanning every window, every shadow, every rooftop, because it felt like she was already being hunted not with bullets, but with knowledge, the kind of knowledge only someone who had survived her could possess. She passed soldiers who nodded with respect, and others who looked away as if sensing that something unclean had attached itself to her like smoke after fire. Inside, The bunker, they sealed the doors behind her and handed her a headset rigged to isolate the incoming signal and trace its origin through back-channel frequencies. Mia hesitated before putting it on, knowing that once she did this, she would hear more than just a voice. She would hear everything she had tried to forget. The moment the headset touched her ears, the static cleared and the voice returned clearer than ever and full of something darker than rage, something older than revenge. It spoke in a language she almost understood, not Arabic, not English, but something between the two phrases she remembered from that night in the village when the mission had gone wrong and her team had followed the wrong signal into the heart of a lie. She closed her eyes and the words poured in like water rising around her ankles. First, then knees, then chest, until she could not breathe. The voice reminded her of what she had done, of who she had left behind, of the child with blood on his hands, and the man with eyes full of fire who had not screamed when the building came down around them. He had simply stared at her until the dust swallowed everything. The tech team shouted that the signal was bouncing from the North Ridge, but by the time the drone reached the coordinates, all it found was an old comms relay half buried in the sand and broadcasting an endless loop of her name over and over again, like a mantra, like a curse. Someone had planned this with precision. They had calculated her departure date, her location, her habits. They had waited until she was almost gone, almost safe. And then they reached in and pulled her back into the nightmare, with just a whisper. Mia yanked the headset off and stood quickly, her breath ragged, her fists clenched because she knew this would not stop. This was not some random threat. This was someone calling her to finish what she started, and it would not end until one of them was buried for good. She requested a ride to the ridge against protocol, against every rule. But her request was granted not because the commander believed her, but because she outranked the fear in his eyes, and because deep down everyone sensed this was her war and they were only bystanders. The jeep kicked up a cloud of dust as it rolled toward the perimeter. The sun now fully vanished, leaving the world in a shadowed haze where anything could be hiding the soldiers. Beside her were quiet professionals with rifles and sharp eyes, but even they seemed smaller now, more fragile, as if they too were prey under a predator's gaze. They reached the edge of the ridge and began to climb on foot, every step louder than it should be, every heartbeat echoing like a drum in her skull. Mia led the way, her hand on her sidearm, her eyes sweeping left and right, searching for any sign of glass-metal motion, anything to prove this was real and not just her mind fracturing under the pressure of what she had buried. Halfway up the slope, she paused. Something caught the light, a shimmer in the rocks to the west. She signaled a halt, crouched and stared until the shape resolved into something far worse than she expected. It was not a person, not a sniper, but a recording unit. A solar-powered signal relay wired into a weatherproof case built to survive years of exposure, and its purpose was clear. It was broadcasting only to her. She approached it slowly and saw what lay beside it, a single dog tag scorched along the edge, partially melted, but the name was still visible, not hers, not any soldier from her unit, but someone from the target list of the Al-Raqqa mission. Someone who was marked as deceased, someone whose file was sealed under top clearance and whose image had haunted her dreams for months. She picked it up and turned it over once, twice, then froze as the signal clicked off, replaced by a new voice. Not the same, not male, but a child speaking, in perfect English, asking her, "Why did you leave him to die?" She spun around, weapon raised, heart hammering, because behind her, the ridge was no longer empty, and the silhouette standing at the top was not holding a weapon, but something else. Something she could not yet see, but it glinted once in the moonlight, just enough for her to know that the real war had just begun. Mia did not lower her weapon, not even when the figure raised both hands in a slow, measured motion, stepping forward just enough to catch the moonlight on his face, revealing features that were both unfamiliar and unmistakable, because sometimes the dead come back with different eyes, different skin, different voices. But the truth hides in the way they move and the way they look at you like they never left the fire they died in. She took one step back, lowering her stance, adjusting her grip as the soldiers flanked her silently, waiting for orders. Their rifles trained, but fingers still unsure because there was no threat. Only a man and a voice and something about him that made the wind still and the air feel too heavy to breathe. The figure said her name again, softer this time. Almost a question, like he was making sure she was real. Like he could not believe she had actually come back, and Mia answered without speaking, her silence sharp enough to cut the space between them, her stare fixed on his hands not for weapons, but for truth. He held out a device, something small metal blinking with red light, and placed it on the ground, then stepped away from it, arms still raised, and when one of the soldiers moved to approach, she stopped him with a single motion. This was her moment, her history, her mistake unfolding in real time, and no one else could fix it. The device was a transmitter linked to the old frequency, the same one that had carried the voice to her radio, to her dreams, to the base, and it was pre-programmed with a loop of messages, timestamps, coordinates, and recordings from nights she had tried to forget, and yet there they were stored and cataloged like trophies from a war she thought she had walked away from. She picked it up and played the first file, and her own voice came through the speaker, calling targets, calling shots, authorizing. Strikes her words, flat, cold, efficient, and followed by static, and then screaming, and then silence. And the man watched her the whole time, not accusing, not pleading, just waiting. He finally spoke again, telling her he had found the wreckage years ago, scavenged the remains of the mission, pieced together fragments of radios and bodies and stories, the ones no one ever reported, the ones buried under classified seals. And she realized with dawning horror that this man had spent years reconstructing the ghosts she had tried to forget. He told her the boy had lived, but not for long. He had carried him out of the rubble, broken, burned, silent, and they wandered the desert together until the boy died in his arms from wounds that no medic could fix, and no prayer could reach, and he buried him with bare hands beneath the ruins of a village no one remembered anymore. Mia felt her hands shaking, not from fear, but from something colder, something deeper, the realization that he had not come for revenge. Not in the way she expected. He had come to pass something on, to transfer the burden she had dropped and walk away from it forever. The soldiers behind her shifted, unsure what to do with a man who did not raise his voice or fire a shot, but had still managed to breach their defenses and bring their strongest soldier to her knees without touching her. She asked him, why now? Why today? And he said because this was the last day she would be a soldier, and he could not let her leave without remembering who she had been, because forgetting was worse than dying, and silence was more dangerous than war. The wind picked up again as if the desert itself had paused to listen, and Mia turned away from him, eyes scanning the ridgeline as if expecting more, as if this was not the end, but only another beginning. And then she saw it. A second shimmer to the north, barely visible but unmistakable, the same kind of relay tower tucked into the rocks and broadcasting something different, something new. She led the team toward it, fast, quiet, covering ground in practiced motion until they reached the edge of the rocks and found not a relay this time, but a cache buried in sand beneath camouflage, netting a hardened case sealed with biometric lock, and when she placed her hand on it, the lid clicked open and inside lay folders, photographs, maps, and a small digital drive marked with the insignia of a black ops unit she thought had been dissolved years ago. She flipped through the contents, recognizing names, locations, missions they were never supposed to revisit, and at the center of it all was a photo of her taken without her knowledge. Weeks ago, maybe less, her boarding a helicopter. Her profile outlined against the sunrise and scrawled beneath. It in handwriting she had not seen in almost a year were the words, "You are not done." She stood slowly back, straight heart pounding, mind racing, Because this was not personal vengeance. This was orchestration. This was someone pulling strings from. Deep inside the shadows and using the man on the ridge as bait, as messenger, as proof that ghosts could be weaponized if you knew where to look and how long to wait. She turned to the man and asked who gave him the file, and he said he never knew. The name only a voice that promised closure and truth, and he had believed it until now, until he saw her face again, and realized closure was a lie, and truth was just another weapon. Mia felt something shift inside her, a fracture closing or opening. She could not tell which, and she knew she had two choices: walk away and pretend again, or follow the trail that had just opened before her, paved in silence, blood and secrets. She looked back toward the base, now a distant outline beneath the moonlit sky, and then toward the man who had once been an enemy, or maybe a victim, and was now neither. And she nodded once, a signal without words, because she understood now that war does not end with orders or flights or flags. It ends when the last secret is uncovered and the last ghost is named. The man stepped aside and let her pass, and the soldiers followed without question. Their weapons lowered their eyes, uncertain, and as they descended the ridge, the device in her hand pulsed once more, and a new voice came through, this one filtered, distorted, and unmistakably familiar. It said, "Welcome back, Mia. We have been waiting."